automated voice. There we go. And I will pass the microphone over to the lovely folks who will be leading you through this morning's session. Enjoy your time together, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Courtney. Hi, everyone. Very nice to be here. I'm Runa Das. I'm an associate professor at Royal Roads University. And together we've got, I hope, some very exciting things to talk about and research to talk about and share with you all. Just before we get started, I quickly want to mention I'm based in Victoria, which is the land of the Lekwungen and Kwisatz peoples. So we're part of a larger group called Community Housing Canada. We're a group of researchers, academics, and practitioners and community partners across Canada, such as BC and PHA. And so together, we aim to co-create knowledge to plan for a sustainable and resilient community housing system. So there are 6 teams involved in the Community Housing Canada project or initiative. And I'm leading Area 2, which is formally titled Enhancing Building Performance in Community Housing in Canada. So our specific objectives for this area is to inform investment and program decisions on the performance of community housing buildings. And so we're going to hear a little bit about this from Shabnam today. To develop holistic approaches for assessing costs and benefits of adopting sustainable technologies and designs in community housing. And both of the researchers today can kind of talk to this point, and to look at partnerships and strategies that support sustainability and resilience in community housing via innovative approaches to repair, renewal, design, and construction. And if you're interested in this Community Housing Canada initiative, I welcome you to check us out. If you Google Community Housing Canada, will pop up, I'm sure. So, and there's lots of teams doing really, really interesting work around community housing in Canada. So we're really, really interested in all the different folks that inform or are participating in this sector. And so if you'd like to introduce yourself, perhaps in the chat, that'd be fantastic. We'd love to hear from you. And then I'm going to pass it along to Shabnam. Is that how we're going to do this? Okay, so I'm going to pass it along to Shabnam, who's a master's student at Royal Roads University in the Master of Environment and Management program. And Shabnam, if you want to, add a little bit more, feel free to do that. And yeah.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Rona. Hi, everyone. I'm Shabnam Edalatnia. As Rona said, I'm a master's student, hopefully defense soon. And I'm from Victoria, which is the land of the Lekwungen people speaking. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, it's here. Okay, I hope that you all can see my screen. Okay, perfect. Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to this presentation. The topic I would like to talk about that is building energy retrofit strategies in community housing in British Columbia, which is my thesis topic. In the next, oops, I cannot. In the next 20 minutes, first, I will give you an introduction about this research, including a definition and explanation about the community housing, the issues and challenges they are facing, the research goals, research questions, and after that, I will quickly talk about the main concepts that guided this research. Methodology, results, and discussions are other parts that I will discuss after that. And then I will wrap my presentation with conclusions and recommendations. The term community housing, which you may know as social housing or affordable housing, is an umbrella term which is typically referred to the housing that is owned and operated by either the public government, nonprofit organization, or cooperative societies with different levels of capacity, challenges, opportunities, and experiences. The construction of the community housing was started in 1949 under the agreement between the federal government and provinces and territories, and it continues to this date. However, over these 70 years, the community housing sector has been significantly impacted by Canada's housing policy, different programs, and different funding models. One of these policy with an extreme adverse impact on community housing was in 1919, when the federal government decided to discontinue all of its responsibility for community housing and terminate all of its funding for the construction and maintenance of the existing community housing units. So under this policy, the provincial government was obligated to fund the maintenance and operation expenses in the community housing units, and it resulted in fiscal burden on the provinces and provincial government and the housing providers. So after a while, it resulted in the extensive postponed maintenance in the existing community housing units. As a result, I could say that many of the structural and mechanical problems that we witness today in the existing community housing units, such as inefficient heating system, lack of cooling system, poor insulation, they are all actually a legacy of this policy. Although the federal government under the different programs, after a while re-engaged to the community housing and prioritize its maintenance and the retrofit. However, there are the cost barriers that can prevent the extensive implementation of the retrofits in the community housing. So with this background in mind, and as the retrofit strategies and retrofits of the community housing, improving their energy efficiency and their conditions is a priority for the federal government and the provincial government, I decided to conduct this research to understand the efficiency of energy consumption in the community housing buildings in British Columbia, identify the underperforming buildings, which means buildings with higher energy consumption and higher level of greenhouse gas emissions compared to the similar buildings, and attempt to find solutions, optimized solutions or retrofit solution ways to make these buildings more efficient. In my research, I follows two questions, two main questions. I try to answer two main questions. The first one is how do different types of community housing buildings, such as low-rise, mid-rise, and high-rise buildings in BC differ in their energy performance, in their energy consumption, and their greenhouse gas emissions, and how do different retrofit scenarios improve these underperforming buildings? Two main concepts guided this research. The first one is building energy performance, which is defined as the amount of energy required to provide building services such as heating, cooling, and lighting. Building energy performance is affected by various factors, and assessing the energy performance and the energy consumption in buildings compared to the similar buildings can give us insight about the efficiency of buildings in a portfolio. So we can identify underperforming buildings, and we can prioritize them for the retrofit project. So building energy performance assessment and benchmarking actually is an essential steps before planning for any retrofit project and any retrofit strategies. But the retrofit strategies is another concept that guided this research. It's defined as any upgrades in a building that can result in energy saving and greenhouse gas emissions reduction. There are different types of building energy retrofit, as you all definitely know. For assessing and evaluating different retrofit strategies, it's necessary to look at them and investigate them from the environmental perspective and social perspective, in addition to the cost. So based on I said, this research involves three main phases. The first phase is building performance assessment. In this phase, I benchmarked 23 buildings managed and operated by BC Housing and Coolidge Society. I benchmarked these buildings by using Energy Star Portfolio Manager and their monthly utility data. The second phase is running regression analysis to investigate the relationship between energy consumption in the buildings and some factors. And the last phase is evaluating the costs and benefits of different retrofit scenarios. As I mentioned, and as I said, we could get data on 23 buildings managed and operated by BC Housing and Coolidge Society. The majority of buildings are in Victoria and Vancouver, but there are 4 buildings in other parts of BC. These buildings are different in terms of their characteristics, mechanical system, occupancy type, and number of occupants. Based on the data set I developed from these buildings data, the majority of buildings are mid-rise buildings, which were built between 1971 and 1980. From the mechanical system, most buildings, the majority of buildings are heated by electricity. The hot water, domestic hot water, are provided by gas-fired boilers and hydronic system. And most buildings lack cooling system. Also, based on the services, these buildings divided to shelter, supportive housing for seniors, subsidized affordable housing. And in most buildings, housing providers, BC Housing and Coolidge Society pay for the utilities. The first phase was building energy benchmarking. I used Energy Star Portfolio Manager and to calculate 5 energy performance indicators, such as weather normalized annual energy consumption, weather normalized energy use intensity, total greenhouse gas emissions intensity, and energy cost. I calculated and analyzed these energy performance indicators between 2019 and 2021 based on the monthly utility data that we could get from housing providers. Here you can see a summary of the results related to annual energy consumption and energy use intensity of these 23 buildings. The graph ranked buildings based on their annual energy consumption from the top and the highest energy consumer at the top and the lowest energy consumer at the bottom. The results show that in almost in all in most buildings, the energy consumption in 2020 was higher than 2019 and 2021. And also high-rise buildings has the highest energy consumption compared to other types of buildings in the data set. The second graph here shows the results related to energy use intensity and ranked buildings based on the energy use intensity. The results related to energy use intensity also shows high-rise buildings, higher energy use intensity compared to the other types of building, and also compared to the average energy use intensity of high-rise buildings in British Columbia. Also, we have 2 mid-rise buildings here among the highest buildings with the energy use intensity. So I could say that the results related to energy use intensity, energy consumption and energy use intensity shows high-rise buildings at the top of the graph as the highest energy consumer. But also the results and the analysis from the energy consumption per unit shows in all of these 23 buildings, energy consumption per unit was lower than the average in BC, which means that the residents in community housing may use less energy compared to other residents in BC. This graph shows the results related to greenhouse gas emissions and greenhouse gas emissions intensity. Again, the graph ranked building based on the GHG emissions. So the results show that the buildings, the high-rise buildings, have the highest have the highest greenhouse gas emissions compared to the other buildings, and you can see the differences is significant. The second graph here ranked building based on the greenhouse gas emissions intensity, and again the high-rise buildings are at the top of the graph, and the average greenhouse gas emissions intensity in the high-rise buildings was higher than the average in higher than the average of greenhouse gas emissions intensity of high-rise buildings in BC. So the analyzing and calculating and analyzing of these energy performance indicators shows that the high-rise buildings in the data set have the higher energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions compared to the other types of buildings in the data set, and also compared to the average in British Columbia. Following this section, I run some single regression analysis to investigate the relationship between building energy consumption and some various factors such as construction year, building area size, number of stories, number of units, and number of occupants. The result shows that there is a relationship between annual energy consumption and building floor area size, stories, number of stories, number of units, and number of occupants. It means that in the building with a larger floor area size and more number of stories and units, energy consumption are higher. And it's because, for example, with a larger floor area size and more number of stories, there's more potential for energy loss, and so higher energy demand in the building. And also with higher number of occupants, energy demand will increase, and so energy consumption will increase. But the regression analysis doesn't show a meaningful relationship between energy consumption and the construction year. And as you can see in this graph, over the construction year, the energy consumption increased, and for buildings which were constructed between 1917 and 1980, the energy consumption is higher than the other buildings. But again, over the construction year and after 1980, the energy consumption decreased. So it doesn't actually show that the construction year and energy consumption can be related, but it shows that the higher energy consumption in high-rise buildings can be related to the characteristics like the larger floor area size, more number of stories, number of units, and the number of occupants. In addition to the characteristics, the building characteristics, it's also important to identify who paid for the utilities, because based on the results from the box plot and WSCare in the BC Housing properties, where BC Housing pay for the utilities, this graph, the average energy consumption is higher than other groups. In addition, it's important to identify the types of the heating system. You can see in this graph the average energy consumption in the buildings which have a space heating with gas-fired boiler. Here, the average energy consumption is higher than other groups. And it's because the space heating provide and accounts for a large share of energy consumption in buildings. And so the efficiency and types of the heating system can impact on the energy consumption, as the gas-fired boilers have a less efficiency compared to the electric baseboard or heat pumps. So the energy consumption, the higher energy consumption in high-rise buildings can be related to various factors like the characteristics and the type and efficiency of their heating system, or even the groups or the sections who pay for the utilities. The last part of this research was evaluating the cost and benefits of different retrofit scenarios. or case studies. We have 4 different retrofit scenarios. The first one is the roof and wall insulation and replacement of doors and windows. The other retrofit scenarios, here, so we have 5 different retrofit scenarios. The first one is insulation, and other ones is electrification, including installation of the domestic hot water heat pump, MUA heat pump, HRV heat pump, and the last retrofit scenarios is fuel switching and installation of mini split heat pumps and electric domestic hot water. I evaluated these retrofit scenarios with 6 different indicators, including financial indicators and environmental indicators. The first indicators was the retrofit investment cost. Looking at the total investment cost shows that the installation of the domestic hot water can have the highest total investment cost, but analysis based on the total investment cost per unit shows that the installation of heat pump, mini split heat pumps and electric domestic hot water have the highest investment cost per unit with almost $30,000. Analysis based on the NPV, I actually calculated NPV with a different discount rate. So the analysis of NPV for these 5 retrofit scenarios shows that almost all retrofit scenarios have a negative NPV at the discount rate higher than 2.5%, and so they won't repay. And analysis based on the payback period shows that the interest rate of 0. Almost all of these retrofit scenarios have a lengthy payback period between 70 to 24 years. So from the financial perspective, these retrofit scenarios are not really feasible to conduct or perform in buildings, especially mini split heat pumps that have the highest installation cost, highest investment cost per unit. But it's really necessary that we look at the environmental indicators and the environmental benefits of this retrofit, as energy saving analysis and greenhouse gas emission emission reduction shows that the installation of mini split heat pumps can save a larger portion of energy and can reduce almost 99% of the greenhouse gas emissions from buildings. So although it has the highest investment cost per unit, but it can result in the larger saving, significant saving on energy consumption, and it can reduce significantly can reduce significantly the GHG emissions. The last indicator that I investigated was the utility bill saving, that the result shows installation of the mini split heat pumps, including the electric domestic hot water, can save significant utility bills for people and the housing providers. So I would like to wrap my presentation with some conclusions and recommendations. The results related to building benchmarking shows that the high-rise buildings have the highest energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions, and so in almost all energy performance indicators, they perform worse than compared to the other types of buildings in the data set, and also compared to the average in BC. So it's really necessary that the housing providers, the decision makers prioritize these buildings for the retrofits. And also it's necessary that before planning, they look at the cost and benefits of electrification project, and also installation of the mini split heat pumps, and including the domestic hot waters, as it can provide a significant opportunity, greater opportunity for saving energy and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Also, installation of the mini split heat pumps can provide the cooling system for residents of for occupants and residents of the community housing buildings, and it can address and can offset part of the lower energy consumption per unit in this housing sector. And also, as the heat waves are becoming so common in BC, it's really necessary that that housing providers plan for installation of the air conditioning and cooling system in this housing sector. The other one is that the other results is that it's necessary that we look at both financial, environmental perspective, and also it's really important that we look at the social perspective and social indicators to evaluate the retrofit cost. It was unfortunately because of the time restriction, I couldn't look at this part, but it's for the future study and also for planning in the retrofit project. It's really important that in addition to the cost, in addition to financial and environmental perspective, social indicators also analyzed. So thank you. Thank you, everyone. That's my presentation.
Thanks so much, Shabnam.
Thank you.
That was great. And hopefully we can get some questions from everyone about that in a little bit. But I think the plan is to for Robbie to talk next about her work, and then we'll open it up for some discussions.
Yeah, thank you, Runa and Shabnam. That was so great. I'm so happy to see the work that you've been working on as we've been going through this process together as colleagues. And so I think you can see my screen there. Is that the case? Perfect. Okay, so yeah, so my name is Robbie Humble, and I am a graduate student under Runa's area in the Interdisciplinary Studies program. And I am based in Regina, Saskatchewan, which is in Treaty 4 territory. So this is the traditional lands of the Cree and the Saulteaux and the Lakota and the Dakota peoples, and also the homeland of the Métis. And I've been really grateful to be living on this land and trying to think about my role in kind of, you know, stewarding this land and taking care of it for the next generations and beyond. And basically, I'm just gonna jump right into my research. So for my time, I'm going to give kind of an overview and background of the research. I'll share some of the findings, and then we'll have some time for discussion afterwards, as Runa said. And so, yeah, so basically my research is kind of zooming out from what Shabnam looked at. So she really looked at sort of the buildings level, and I'm really exploring the people and the processes involved during the early stages of potential major projects in existing community housing buildings, so including major renovations, capital upgrades, or energy efficiency retrofits. And so to start, I just wanted to share a bit of the context and motivation around the project. So a few years ago, I was working on some projects related to energy transitions in my community here in Saskatchewan, and was talking to different people about ways to address equity and inclusion. And I saw that, especially in the municipal energy and climate change policy areas, there's a lot of interest in energy efficiency retrofits and social and affordable housing, particularly around some of the things that Shabnam talked about. So the potential for co-benefits, so including things like resident comfort, health, and well-being. And so in addition to addressing things like greenhouse gas emissions and energy use, retrofits can also improve living conditions and quality of life for residents, and reducing costs for operators and or residents, depending on, as Shabnam said, sort of who pays for those utility bills, which is a big question. But so this really got me interested as well, but also got me questioning, you know, were community housing providers really in a position to undertake these kinds of projects? And of course, it's because it's not that simple, right? So Shabnam gave some of the background around this, and you will know this as well. But firstly, the community housing sector faces many challenges around asset management, many of which are the result of the devolution of housing responsibilities and, importantly, decades of underfunding. And so these include, but aren't limited to, issues around insufficient access to capital, high levels of deferred maintenance, and obviously the aging and energy inefficient buildings. But additionally, the sector has also evolved differently in different parts of Canada. And this is part of what really interested me. So for example, in BC, you'll know that the province really stepped up support during the periods of federal withdrawal from housing policy. You know, it could always be better, but there was that, you know, kind of investment and commitment made to try to continue to support the sector. And networks such as BCNPHA, AMA, and CHF working together have obviously been a key part of that, and working with BC Housing. Meanwhile, in Saskatchewan, there really was not a similar level of support throughout that period. And to date, there are really few separate and mostly just voluntary networks. And so even within the same jurisdiction, organizations obviously can have different levels of capacity and ability to undertake these kinds of projects. And then finally, you know, different stakeholders approach decisions around buildings from a variety of objectives. So whether it's the health and safety of residents, cost savings, and then also scales of projects. So small over time repairs to larger whole building or whole home retrofits. And then of course, policymakers have their own objectives, and programs around community housing retrofit and repair in the past and currently, but especially in the past, have often been based on separate policy objectives rather than, you know, a cohesive sort of funding strategy or assessment of the energy efficiency potential of the housing stock. And so to date, most of those programs have seen kind of a mix of results, and ineffective retrofits with smaller energy reductions, but quicker paybacks have often been common. And that's just not what we can really do anymore, right? Like, we really need to be looking at how we're managing this building stock for the future. And so it's within this context that the National Housing Strategy was introduced, potentially representing a new, you know, sort of national coordination of efforts, prioritizing the maintenance and expansion of the community housing stock. So looking at both the repair and renewal, but also integrating goals to reduce emissions and meet social needs for housing. And so just kind of recognizing that this sort of fragmented program-based nature of energy efficiency and climate change programs really kind of mirrors the same sort of process and ad hoc history of the development of the community housing stock. I really think it's important to take a more holistic kind of systems view to understand the scale of the challenges and opportunities around building retrofits in community housing. And so from a systems perspective, the community housing system consists of diverse elements, including people or stakeholders, and what I'm calling materials. So buildings, policies, regulations, these things that kind of mediate and interact with people through processes of negotiations. And so that's sort of the view that I took with this research. But when I look at the existing academic and sector research, most of the topics in this area really focus on kind of the technical aspects of retrofits or case studies of successful projects, or kind of innovative actors, but not a lot of attention to kind of the diversity of actors that are making decisions that affect this building stock. So all these different things around level of capacity, you know, size of provider, these types of things. So there really seems to be a significant gap in our understanding of kind of the early stages of these decisions before a project even gets on the table, right? And therefore, there's a gap also in our understanding of the potential for these types of projects, given where the sector is currently at, and then also the massive amount of need. And so basically I wanted to explore this, the role of different stakeholders in these processes kind of before these projects get going. And the big picture here really is that the current context of the housing sector is a result of previous decisions about buildings made by numerous actors over time. And buildings last a long time. They play a critical role in the social and economic and cultural life. And so really the decisions that we're making on a day-to-day basis are shaping the intersection of social and environmental outcomes for decades and generations to come. And so again, that sort of different motivation around what's moving people to make these decisions illustrates that we need to really be looking at addressing the fragmentation of all of these policies. And so my aim is to really help improve our understanding of how these processes unfold in different urban off-reserve jurisdictions, specifically using Saskatchewan and BC as examples, and then using this information to make recommendations for improving programs and policies, including for energy efficiency, to have a better chance of actually achieving these positive outcomes that we are all hoping for. And so my research question became, how do community housing stakeholders shape decision-making processes related to energy efficiency retrofits in community housing systems, with 3 sub-questions. So first, who are the actors involved in the retrofit decision-making process? What are the key materials? So for example, building characteristics, policies, programs, or regulations that are involved. And then how do these actors and materials influence the retrofit decision-making process? And also how do these interactions relate to local context? And so Shabnam shared a similar definition of community housing, but just for context, this is a definition primarily sourced from the National Housing Strategy, which has its benefits and its challenges, but I really wanted to take kind of a big picture view of the sector. And then one of the first steps actually for doing this project was creating a more holistic definition of energy efficiency retrofits that was a bit more able to coexist with the asset management activities of providers. So I brought in my focus from energy efficiency retrofits as a definition to major projects in existing buildings. So really framing retrofits as just one type of possible decision within the ongoing asset management decision-making processes, along with capital upgrades and major renovations. And so by considering the energy efficiency retrofits in this way, it really the research could recognize the many different potential motivations or opportunities or barriers for these kinds of projects, because there's so many different people and different places where they're at. So specifically, I looked more in depth, like I said, at the very early stages of these projects. So including potential project identification, prioritization, design, and approvals. So this can involve things like identifying issues with the building or deciding when, if, or how to make changes or improvements to the building. And then obviously recognizing that these phases don't happen in a straight line, right? Some may take place at the same time, or earlier decisions may have to be revisited later again, later in the process. And so I really wanted to focus on the kinds of activities and tasks that happen during each of these phases and how, and not necessarily when. So I used multiple methods to explore this question, with each method informing the next. So first, desk research informed the design of an online survey targeting organizations who operate or manage community housing buildings in either Saskatchewan or BC, and specifically encouraged participation from 2 groups. So first, those with formal decision-making authority, such as executive directors or board members. And then secondly, building maintenance and or facility staff who are responsible for overseeing, the day-to-day operations. And people did not have to have experience with major projects. I really wanted a variety of experience in this area, and we did get that. And through this process, survey respondents were asked to identify the key people that they interact with throughout any of the early stages of this decision-making process, both within their organization, such as other staff or volunteers, as well as external groups like consultants or funders. And then through open-ended questions, they were also asked to identify the key factors that influence these early stages of the decision-making process as well. And so first, I was able to analyze this data to look at the role and influence of different stakeholders in these early stages, and then also consider any potential differences or similarities between Saskatchewan and BC. Unfortunately, my survey response in BC was not very large. And so some areas I was able to do that and some areas I wasn't, but as noted, kind of going through to comment on that where we can. And then secondly, to identify those key variables that influence the decision-making process overall, and also to inform a recruitment list for focus groups and or interviews through like a snowball sampling approach. And then that second phase involved focus groups with nonprofit housing providers in Saskatchewan and other stakeholders involved in the nonprofit system in Saskatchewan. And then semi-structured interviews with provincial stakeholders in Saskatchewan and in BC. So the data from the focus groups was used to construct a qualitative systems map describing the factors that influence during each of these different stages. And then interview data was used alongside other document and research analysis to consider sort of the broader context of how this all might fit in, depending on the different areas. So here's just a snapshot of the number of participants in the different methods. And so, as I said, I didn't have as many participation in the survey in BC, which also influenced my ability to do the focus groups there. So I had 31 respondents in Saskatchewan, 10 in BC, and I'll dive into the focus groups a little bit later. And so the majority of respondents were from nonprofit organizations, which kind of mirrors a lot of the sector. And then that was distantly followed by the provincial government and cooperatives, although there was a higher number of cooperatives in BC. And so for the bulk of the analysis, I just want to note that I did end up excluding the provincial government as it was difficult to compare, obviously, due to the large portfolios and specific roles, but where possible, I did try to include them and noted throughout. And so they were also asked to identify the housing services that their organization either currently manages or operates or has plans to offer within the next 3 to 5 years. And so you can see, particularly in Saskatchewan, it had a large number of respondents that provide like disability services or group homes in particular, as well as seniors organizations. There was also a post-secondary institution that had an operating agreement with the province, and then also a private sector organization that managed provincial housing. And so these are, some of the folks that participated. And the largest group of respondents of the survey were senior managers, so including executive directors, as well as other senior management that are specific for, are responsible for a specific area. So particularly around maintenance facilities or capital assets, as well as board members. So 3 of the 4 board members that completed the survey were from cooperative organizations. And then the 4th was from a nonprofit organization. So it just gives a snapshot of who is involved in kind of providing this data. And so if we move into some of the results, so from the stakeholder survey portion, there was a total of 175 internal stakeholders identified as involved in the early stages. For this, I actually did combine Saskatchewan and BC because the structure of the organizations were quite similar, and it didn't really provide much information in terms of comparison. So I thought it was better to kind of include it for all organizations. So this chart describes the roles and the different project phases during which each of these groups are involved. And so there's 6 different areas that they've been grouped into. So obviously, as you can see, board members were most frequently identified and were more involved usually during the prioritization and approval stages. And within this, the board executive or the specific member, so for example, a board president or the executive as a whole, was most often identified and were more consistently involved across all of the project stages than other board members. And then the senior management was the second largest group identified. And as you can see, was like pretty consistent across all of these different early stages. While these were the largest group of survey respondents, they also, so because they were the largest group of survey respondents, they also kind of make up a large portion of the stakeholder group. But this group, particularly senior management, so executive directors, were also consistently identified by others in the survey, right? So the other area, so basically the other area I wanted to mention is around senior managers around facility maintenance or capital assets. And so although these actors were more often noted in larger organizations, so organizations that had more than 50 staff. And so that makes sense given the increased authority and responsibility of senior roles, particularly in larger organizations, and also aligns with research from the UK that shows that larger social housing organizations increasingly rely on internal information and supports during retrofit processes. So I thought that was interesting. And then also the responses around board members were interesting because it showed sort of varied perspectives on how individual and organizational aspects kind of shape stakeholder involvement. So for example, some people really seem to emphasize more personal characteristics, for example, like knowledgeable board members or people that had a lot of passion or expertise in an area, while others kind of identified them more in terms of their formal role, right? Like a core component of the governance structure. And then others actually shared a lot of kind of tensions between these two processes as well, right? Like maybe there's a formal decision-making authority, but maybe not a lack of information or connection with some of the frontline operations. So I thought that was really interesting. And then the respondents were also asked to identify from the stakeholders that they identified who was the most influential among that process and to describe why they chose their answer. And so for these questions, they were able to choose they could also include themselves in that choice, and many did. And executive directors were obviously, you can see, more often chosen, followed by board members. And then again, that's the senior managers for maintenance and capital assets. And I wanted to note, sir, that roughly half of the survey respondents who answered this question actually did select themselves as the most influential stakeholder, including 89% of the executive directors who performed the survey. And so it's not really surprising because the survey encouraged participation by those involved in making decisions about community housing buildings. But also these actors did also identify themselves as being either very involved, so responsible, or somewhat involved or consulted in most of the project phases. So including identification, but particularly prioritizing. That really came out as a project phase that seemed to be connected with the folks that were being identified as having some of the most influence in the process. That prioritization stage seemed really important. But when I dig down a little deeper, there's some differences observed that might also align with the size of the building portfolio. So, and that also align with sort of the areas of responsibility between smaller and larger organizations, right? So organizations that operated one building had the widest distribution among who was being identified as the most influential in that process. And then in the there was a larger influence of the board of directors, but also property managers. So day-to-day site managers who are on site managing the buildings. They were often pointed to as having a lot of knowledge in that day-to-day process, and so being relied on. Moving into the middle group, the executive directors were more consistently identified, and then in the larger organizations, so more than 20 buildings, they seemed less likely to name the executive director as the most influential stakeholder, and instead to point to that manager of facilities or capital assets. So it could be related to the size of the organization, could be related to a lot of other factors as well, but it seems to be something to consider, right? That the size of organizations, as we know, has a lot of role to play. So moving to the external stakeholders. So there was 10 different types of organizations and 41 subtypes, which I'm not going to go into, that were identified by survey respondents. So they're listed here in alphabetical order. And not all of these stakeholders were identified in both provinces, but just to give you a sense, so a wide range of consultants, contractors. The most noted was just like a contractor or tradespeople, but some that were specifically mentioned are listed there. In the finance and insurance category, it was these were really only identified in Saskatchewan, which was interesting. Again, there was a smaller response in BC, but among the finance and insurance, it was really credit unions that seemed to be noted. Foundations or trusts were only noted among BC respondents, which I thought was interesting. And then the federal government actually was only noted by 2 respondents in BC, which is interesting, but also their participation might be a bit more mediated by other particularly government stakeholders. So for example, the province and the municipalities. It seems that through focus group discussions, folks talked a little bit more about how the federal government programs were being accessed or, you know, navigated through accessing through other stakeholders. The provincial government had a wide range of groups, but particularly in Saskatchewan, and I'll show you that in a moment. And then in terms of the municipalities, the most common identification was just simply, you know, the city of blank. But otherwise, there was a wide variety of departments that were named. And then in the nonprofit area, there was a couple of sector associations as well as economic development groups, and also a parent organization. So one organization that was like a subsidiary that really only pointed to their parent organization as the only organization that they work with. So that was another sort of interesting nuance. Excuse me. So if I look at the phase involvement, so you can see Saskatchewan is on the top, BC is on the bottom there. And other than the provincial government actors, which I'll talk about in a moment, contractors and trades were the largest group identified in Saskatchewan. And they were most often involved during the potential project design as well as the identification. But it's interesting because considering the high number of mentions in Saskatchewan, contractors and tradespeople were somewhat absent among the respondents from BC, again, although it's a small number. But in contrast, consultants really had the most frequency of mentions in BC. And I also noticed that respondents from either province who reported being either currently involved in a project or having plans to undertake one were also seemed more likely to identify consultants. And so the fact that more respondents in BC actually met this criteria. So there was 89% of BC respondents said that they were either currently in a project or were going to be, compared with 56% in Saskatchewan. So that could have influenced that as well. But also participants did comment from BC around the process of building condition assessments and consultants being a part of that process, which was not something that was really talked about or discussed among the Saskatchewan respondents. So that's a big area of future exploration. And then around provincial government, so this is a bit, I have these separated based on the different kind of ministries or areas that were identified. So in BC, it was really BC Housing that was primarily identified, except for, I believe it was the Health Authority was another group that was mentioned. But in Saskatchewan, although 70% of the respondents named a provincial government actor, like a specific actor, it was spread over at least 5 different branches, agencies, or ministries, only one of which was the Saskatchewan Housing Corporation, the counterpart to BC Housing. And so it really seemed that the involvement and influence was based on the owner of the building and also the housing services or agreements in place. But I couldn't actually examine that in depth because I didn't, that would have been a whole other project. So, but important, I'll talk about that in a moment. And then, as I noted, other funders such as foundations and trusts weren't really mentioned in Saskatchewan. And nonprofit organizations were really mentioned only in small numbers both in BC and Saskatchewan. And that was interesting because I feel like from some of the comments, they did still play a role and they were discussed as being really important, but I think playing more of that mediation and that facilitation role. So they weren't always identified as a specific actor kind of directly being involved. So there might be something more to look at there. In looking at the most influence among external stakeholders, it's really a wide variety, and it's difficult to draw any specific conclusions about this. But again, some of those potential relationships seem to really be linked to the type of organization, and so likely the operating and funding agreements in place. Among the contractors or tradespeople, that was also mentioned, and it seemed to be more mentioned among cooperatives, and who also did not identify funders as much, or specifically provincial funders as well. So looking at the contractors and tradespeople as well as consultants, this is important because the trust of building professionals in the renovation, maintenance, and improvement sector, as well as their associated knowledge and familiarities either with specific systems or specific buildings, has been shown to be important in the ability to actually advance retrofits at this scale. There's a lot of advice that's sought in this area. And also that is, as I said, kind of related to the specific building, right? So as one respondent listed who listed several contractors or tradespeople, they said they couldn't pick one because it is being the most influential, because it obviously depended on the issue, right? Like what was happening with the building at that time, who they would see as being the most important person to work with. And then looking at some of the government funders. So in Saskatchewan, the community living was mentioned often, and that would have been among those organizations providing like often group homes and disability services. And there was a range of kind of language around some of that process. So for example, seeing them as the primary funder, some of the comments were, they can take a project off the table from the beginning if they don't find value in it. So really a range of like advice being sought and expertise to kind of having a veto over the whole process. So quite a range. And I'm just doing some qualitative analysis of the rationale that people provided around both the internal stakeholders and the external. Internally, many spoke to their role as being rationale for their influence. So for example, I'm responsible for this. This is my job. But also that kind of facilitation and recommendations piece, right? Or having knowledge of the building and the issues that the residents were having was also seen to be a factor in that as well. Whereas externally, funding was obviously a big one, right? The availability of funding, and then also a little bit more of that technical knowledge and expertise as well, as I said. I'm going to move on, but basically this piece talked about the wide variety. So, the executive director, as an example, they're saying I'm an executive director, but I struggle because the government funding doesn't provide sufficient resources. So yes, they're responsible. They see they have a big role in that influence, but it's kind of constrained by how they interact with the external folks. I think I talked about these as I went through, so I'm going to jump forward because I've already gone over my time. And I wanted to talk about the focus groups. So during the focus groups, a list of the key factors that were most frequently identified through the survey were presented to participants to identify the most influential factors across the different project phases. And then these concepts were weighted by aggregating the participant responses to form the initial structure of this map. And so they were asked two questions. So in your experience, what is the process for either identifying, prioritizing, designing, or approving potential major projects? So kind of going phase by phase. And then what are the key factors that influence the process the most at that stage? And they were asked to identify up to a maximum of 3, just to kind of make the map a little bit more feasible. So I'll show you this in the map in a second, but just to get a sense, these were some of the most noted factors during the survey. So looking at building issues, health and safety regulations, building codes and permits. The funding was broken down into kind of mention of just the availability of funding versus the conditions of that funding. Some of the policies or procedures, from financial and budgeting to operating agreements, and then community issues and the impact on residents. So this is the result of that. I'm going to go I'm going to go into it a little bit phase by phase, but overall, there was 16 factors identified as influencing the different stages of decision making. And 3 were most frequently identified, both in terms of their identification among multiple participants, as well as across all of the 4 project phases. And so these are presented sort of central in the map as well as larger, demonstrating their significant influence across these stages. So this was the availability of funding, the impact on residents, and the building issues. They were continually talked about and ranked. Although folks weren't asked to rank them, they often did kind of list them in order, and these were consistently talked about. There were also 3 additional factors that were frequently identified across all 4 project stages, but by less participants than the former ones. So this was health and safety regulations, building codes or permits, and then that conditions of funding piece. So these were also central in the map, given that they're connected across, multiple phases as we go throughout. So I just wanted to quickly show a couple of the project phases. So during the identification stage, the most influential were, again, those building issues, availability of funding, and the impact on residents. But for organizations that have access to data and information, such as building condition assessments or inspection reports, those also really influence the identification stage. Obviously, through identifying end of life systems, but also particularly talked about systems that have an impact on residents, right? So that major project can be planned for or avoided by extending the life of these systems to limit the impact that it would have on residents. Other processes that were noted included, monitoring spikes in maintenance requests and inspections, and that was particularly discussed around organizations that were licensed or accredited. There was one organization, it's a shelter organization, that really discussed their own accreditation process that they developed because there wasn't really a process for shelters. And so even within their organization, kind of going through their annual processes to maintain that accreditation process. So yeah, going to the prioritization stage, those factors were still the most influential during prioritization, but additional factors that were layered include assessments of potential risks to infrastructure, as well as the long-term viability of the building. And then if participants did have capital or asset management plans, these was also informed during the prioritization stage. But ultimately, the prioritization would then be driven by the urgency of the building issues, right? And where that funding could be found. Right, as this person says, if something breaks down, it takes priority over everything, right? If your shelter goes out of operation, that has a huge impact. So you're doing everything that you can to avoid that. During project design, there was more distributed responses. And so factors during this stage show a lower influence compared to other ones. And so it could be for a variety of reasons, right? The complexity of undertaking a project, right? And depending on people's experiences, they may have something more top of mind to be drawing on. But the most noted was health and safety regulations, followed by a 3-way tie for the availability of funds, the conditions of the funds, and then the impacts on residents. And the conditions of funding, I wanted to note because it plays a larger role during this stage than in any other stage. And so, so as it was noted in the identification stage, if a funder has money for certain projects, that often shapes once we're at the design stage in terms of the scope of the project or the types of factors that are involved. And then the approval stage. So building issues was again the most influential, followed by the availability of funding and the impact on residents. So here was a great quote from the residents, or not a great quote, a terrible quote, but it's hard. Sometimes we dip into reserve funds here or donated funds to cover the cost of the items because they have to be repaired. We can't have a building without some of the furnaces being operational heading into the winter months, right? So that impact on residents is really what's, and the condition of the building is really what's driving how these issues are being moved forward. So quickly, I'm going to talk about some of the implications from the housing system perspective. So if we look back to the National Housing Strategy, you know, there is this focus on the community housing and repair, but how this is being played out in different provinces and different communities is going to significantly shape what's even possible, right? So there's different targets that are going to be set at those provincial levels and working down into the municipal levels. So I don't have time to really go through all of this, but basically thinking about how, you know, the differences around the types of funding, the types of regulations that are experienced not only through operating agreements, but also at the municipal level in terms of looking at sort of those building regulations and building code issues when they're coming up throughout these projects is really where some of these interaction and negotiation is going to be happening. And so at the federal level, we have, you know, these targets, but at the level of the resident, it's really interacting with the building, and the role of municipalities is really shaping how that process is experienced on a day-to-day. Some of the things I wanted to note around these key issues. So again, the funding availability, building condition or the building issues, and the impact on residents. This is another area where we can think about, you know, how do these issues differ depending on the different jurisdictions. And the building condition data is something that in BC has really been increasing and doing really well. And that really seems to be playing an influence. People talked about the building condition assessments. People talked about having access to that data. More people were undertaking projects, it seemed. And then also that impact on residents. There was heating concerns that were talked a lot about in BC, but also cooling concerns talked about in Saskatchewan. So again, that the furnace going out before the end of winter or before the start of winter was like a no-go, right? Like these are some of the issues that are driving that. The other thing I wanted to note, sorry, here is the portfolio prioritization. So in BC, I understand that the really the community housing portfolio is assessed as a whole, right? With and I think part of that is because of the large nonprofit, the size large of the nonprofit portfolio. But that really, I think, is helping inform how the prioritization of the entire stock is moving forward. As I understood in Saskatchewan, it's really a lot more piecemeal. So the provincial stock kind of has its own assessment. There's been some inroads in terms of group homes, in terms of understanding the conditions of those buildings and doing some assessments around that. And that was really tied to a big investment push that was made to address the waiting list and backlog of housing that was needed. So that kind of responsibility and oversight around that funding seems to really be driving some of the processes there. And so I think there's something to be learned in terms of looking a lot more holistically at the community housing stock as, you know, community infrastructure and investment. So I think I talked about these ones. So recommendations. So the funding programs, I think, really need to be looking at, as I said, that kind of community infrastructure piece and ensuring that buildings are in good condition is critical to operating these housing services. So, you know, if your building goes out of service, that has a huge impact. And we need to be recognizing this as community infrastructure, as critical infrastructure. And looking at how decisions are made at the portfolio level. Providers are making decisions between buildings, between this system and that system, and it's never just one building at a time, right? And so the availability of funding really needs to be expanded to look at the whole cycle of capital repair. So some of the providers talked about major repairs being needed around building envelope and mechanical systems, but also electrical issues, plumbing issues, right? Which one takes priority if the bathroom is getting flooded and there's mold in the house, right? Like we're not going to be looking at replacing the windows. And then, yeah, the eligibility for that funding. And then I think I mentioned this already, but the building condition data, we really need to expand what is accessible. For example, you know, could municipalities really design better policies and programs if they had access to this kind of data as well? this could maybe support the design of more targeted retrofit programs, because there's all these different actors who are creating programs trying to influence this sector, right? And if there was a better sense of actually the type of repairs that were needed, or maybe at the neighborhood level, we could really have a better shot at designing larger, more aggregate programs that could actually potentially meet the scale of what we're trying to do on that. And then I'm going to, this just emphasizes, this is why this is important, right? Like, we know that these issues are there, but we don't have a lot of information around it. So in Saskatchewan, for example, not a lot of up-to-date asset management plans. And I think that the higher number in BC, even though it's a smaller respondent group, really ties back to that big push around the building condition assessments and understanding the current condition of the buildings and how that information is being leveraged by different groups towards a common goal. And I just wanted to note this one because, as Shabnam talked about, the benchmarking, again, small numbers, but really not a lot of people that are using that information, but again, a little bit higher in BC, it seems. So again, some of that push, some of that support that BC and PHA and others are providing seems to be making its way through. And the last thing I want to note is just the further research that's needed. It's really the role of different operating agreements and funding structures that I know is a key part of it, but I was not able to dig into that information. And I understand that BC and PHA has started to do some work kind of streamlining how, you know, funneling providers to different programs based on an understanding of those operating agreements. And I think that more of that is going to be needed, and also in other jurisdictions. And the building conditions, I did ask questions about this in the survey, but it was really difficult because there's such a wide variety of how these questions are asked and understanding of the different tools that were used that I really actually couldn't even ask those questions. So kind of that building asset data and survey across jurisdictions would really benefit from more standardization because yeah, it was really difficult to try to do that piece. Yeah, I think I'm going to end it there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Robbie. That was great. I guess it looks like we have about 15 minutes. So it'd be great to hear from any of you in terms of, you know, any questions or comments that you might have about the work that Shabnam and Robbie's doing. Oh, Kelly, I see a hand up.
Yep. Hello.
Hi.
So recently we had BCNP come to our location. We have a building that's built in 1974. There's 28 units. We're trying to figure out, as a nonprofit society, the value of upgrading or retrofitting in an effort not to throw good money after bad, because it really hasn't been maintained over the years. Would any of, and they've come and look at the building, and we're waiting for the report back. Is any of this activity flowing back to you folks for your studies?
I think sorry. Yeah, actually, based on my understanding, BC and PHA did the energy audit of your building to identify the energy consumption and see how the different parts of the building work. For example, assessing and evaluating its the level of insulation, the heating system, cooling system, ventilation, and other lighting. And then we'll, based on the results and the energy audit, will give you like the energy audit report. We'll give you a report with that will shows the level of energy consumption, greenhouse gas emissions, energy use intensity. And then after that, they will give you several options based on the issues and challenges in the buildings. And then they will give you provide with the cost, NPV, payback period, and based on the organizations and the companies did the energy audits. Some companies will give you some recommendation with the for example, with the priority of the projects, which project or which recommendation has the priority to conduct this in this building. It's what I know from the process of the energy audits in the buildings and how it works.
Awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome.
There's a question in the chat from Anne who says, who are you sharing your research findings with?
I'll just say anyone who will listen, first of all. I'll be working on making the research results into a report that's not a giant thesis for folks who can actually digest it, hopefully. But basically, yeah, the housing associations, the provincial providers, obviously CMHC are folks that are all on my list, as well as some of the housing networks. So for example, like the Community Housing Transformation Center, and the ECHO, so a lot of networks around CMHC as well. I have a long list, happy for any recommendations of folks you can think of, for sure, for my research.
And I think for my research, I will share it mostly with BC Housing and Quillette Society, as they provided us with the information and data of the buildings, the reports, the energy audits. So we will give you them some findings and the reports about this research. Yeah, hopefully that it can help them for the planning of the retrofit projects in the buildings.
Folks are able to like unmute and ask any questions or type in the chat.
Or also, it doesn't just have to be questions too. Like for me, I'm, still in the final processes of writing. And so, I had some of my recommendations, and I won't speak for Shabnam, but if you may feel the same way, recommendations that you have around this as well, or just thoughts on, how does this relate to your experience is also very, very valuable. So, but also questions are great.
Yeah, Anne, go ahead.
I just wanted to make one comment first. Thanks very much for your presentations. It really hits home for us and the projects and experiences that we have had. I enjoyed seeing it from the two perspectives. And we're up in the Northwest Territories, and we're feeling pretty lonely as one of the only multi-unit, not-for-profit buildings that is undergoing this process. So it's great to, learn of experiences in other places across the country. Always great to make those connections. So thank you very much to both of you.
Thank you.
All right, I'm not seeing any other hands or chatter in the chat. So Runa to put in the chat their contact information if you do want to continue to reach out or ask any questions or comments or continue these conversations. Yeah, just want to say a big thank you to our presenters today and to everyone else for participating. It's always great to learn a little bit in our mornings and work together. And so hopefully everyone enjoyed their time, and a big thank you again. And we hope to see you in future online learning events. I'll send out following this session. Give me a couple days to do editing and things, but a recording of our session as well, so that you can rewatch it as often as you would like.
Thank you. Thank you, Courtney.
Thanks so much,
Thanks, folks.
Courtney.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Great to see
you.
you. Thank you.
Enjoy your morning.
Bye.
Bye.